We've spent the last close to 2 years studying public opinion and attitudes and behaviors related to cannabis use in Canada. And the reason why is, as we lift it off, if you wish, on this journey of legalization, the government, newly elected at the time, really placed the views and values of public at the core of their government. And understanding that, to us, was essential in understanding how to move forward on this framework. The research that I'll be drawing on this morning comes from 3 distinct studies. One in March of 2016, close to 1,000 Canadians. 1,500 Canadians were polled about a year later, in May of 2017. And finally, we just came out of field, very fresh research, a few weeks ago in December of 2017 with 1,500 cases. So if we dial this all the way back to the federal election and that time when they first got elected and they said that one of the campaign promises would be legalization, there was a real sense of hope, of sunny ways, if you wish. That was the narrative, if you recall, at the time. But as reality has set in over the past close to 2 years, we find that there are a number of tensions that have opened up, both from a consumer point of view, but also from a regulatory point of view and a political point of view. So we want to understand that so that we can really understand how to move forward as we really are at the cusp of legalization today. So first of all, a few fundamentals. People are paying attention to this issue. We started this research in 2016, and at the time, about 4 in 10 said that they were following the issue closely. In December of 2017, that number is almost at 50% of Canadians, 45. From my point of view, who looks at this stuff all the time, that means that Canadians are watching this with a laser focus. It's pretty hard to capture anyone's attitudes and opinions about or interest in anything, let alone something as big as this. So people are watching. However, over time, support is falling. So in 2016, when we asked about the government planning to make these changes, 60% of Canadians said that they supported legalization. In 2017, at the beginning in the spring, that number had fallen to 43%. And that number remained stable over 2017. But what's interesting is that from the spring to the end of 2017, the middle ground, this sort of neutral ground, has emptied out in favor of Canadians opposing, meaning that opposition is growing across the country. Also, not surprising given that plans are now becoming a reality, and we see that there's polarization on the issue. But for those who are watching this issue closely, they're far more likely to support it. Okay, 55% of those who are watching the issue closely are supporters versus only 23% who are not following the issue at all. What that tells us is that there's this analysis around this echo chamber, okay? So as time increases and this becomes real and industry starts looking at it increasingly and government keeps looking at it increasingly, those who are most supportive of it are the ones who are watching it most closely. And thus begins the echo chamber around cannabis, which we find to be something that's worth knowing, and you'll see a few more data points on that. In terms of support, there are the natural sort of demographic fissures around senior citizens or boomers, less than 4 in 10 supporting versus younger millennials, majority supporting. And we also see that there are strong regional variations on the support. So here in British Columbia, almost 6 in 10 support legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes. However, in Quebec, that number is only 34%. Ontario, only 47%. So there's a lot of regional issues at play in terms of support. So with all of that in mind, we thought we would dial it back to some fundamental priorities. In 2016, prior to striking the task force to legalize cannabis, we went into field and we wanted to know, from a Canadian's point of view, what are some of the core priorities that they want their government to keep in the forefront while going through this legalization process. And it's not surprising because all of these elements were reflected and continue to be reflected in policymakers' thinking. Keeping cannabis out of the hands of minors, avoiding public risk, making it less profitable and attractive to organized crime, educating Canadians on some of the harms, and developing an efficient trap for taxes. Okay? Those core fundamentals remain strong and true today. But where some of the tension lies is that not only are positive impacts of legalization, okay? We asked last spring, what are some of the positive impacts of legalization? Governments will have more tax revenue, Canadians reported back. That it'll be safer, okay? It'll reduce organized crime. Those are good, and those map to those fundamental priorities. However, some of the negative impacts that they reported back to us also map to the core priorities, which creates quite a bit of tension and confusion, frankly. And not only that, it leads to, of course, concern. And there's quite a bit of concern and confusion that we'll walk through here. So first of all, a few weeks ago we were in field, and we wanted to have Canadians sort of reflect on the year that just was. And we asked them, okay, so here's a whole bunch of headlines that dominated in 2017. Which one worries you most? You can only pick one, okay? So first of all, no big surprise. Number one, Donald Trump. Okay, Canadians, 31% said, Donald Trump is what worries me most out of all the ones that we tested. Okay. But then what about the other stuff? 12% terrorism, threat of nuclear war, availability of affordable housing, okay? But look at where cannabis sits in this, bottom line. How governments implement recreational cannabis, 7%. On the surface, you're like, it's not so bad, it's only 7%. But in reality, what you're looking at here is that for almost 1 in 10 Canadians, they chose this as the most concerning and worrisome issue of 2017, which sheds light on the fact of beware of the cannabis bubble, right? Beware of this echo chamber of positive reinforcement, when in reality there are people out in our society that will become broadly part of our consumer base that think that this is one of the most worrisome things, more so than terrorism in 2017. The other issue is that the majority of Canadians agree that mitigating underage access is a real worry for them. It's consistent. It drives concern over and over and over again among supporters and opponents. Also, many would agree that there's a societal impact here that's not being truly understood. That's pretty serious, right? This isn't like a 10-year sort of lifting of prohibition with alcohol back in the day. This is our entire history of our country, really, that we've had this prohibition in place. There are societal implications that need to be addressed, and frankly, the majority of Canadians agree that they aren't being addressed or underestimated, which is quite worrisome for many. And a really good indicator of this that tells us a little bit about this, this sort of positive reinforced echo chamber is this notion of, you know, the sunny ways. I really can't wait for a day for all of this to be over and for it to be legal. You would think that would have a plurality view agree, but in fact, no. Only 28% of Canadians across the country, general population, agree with that notion. 30% don't know, or rather are on the fence. Pretty indicative of the space that we're moving in as we move towards legalization. There's also a challenge in the confidence levels that Canadians have in the decision makers who are responsible for legalization. First of all, most people would agree that they really don't have much confidence in the federal government's action on this file. I think the federal government is doing a good job of handling the cannabis issue. 40% disagree. I'm concerned how my provincial government is going to roll out cannabis legalization. Take a look at some of these numbers. Agree. 47% here in British Columbia, but 60% in Quebec, 54% in Ontario are concerned about how their provinces can actually roll this out, which maps to whether we're on the right track or wrong track. Right track, wrong track, it's about a 30-30-30 split. Plurality view is in fact wrong track on whether these plans are how they're coming to fruition. Look at that by province. Here in British Columbia, 42% say right track, but only 25% in Quebec. Wrong track, 42% in Ontario. These are jurisdictions that have announced their plans, right? And unsure, big numbers around unsure. We're mere months away from a reality that many could not have even conceived a number of years ago, and we're in this sort of situation where there's very little information, it seems, and many are unsure. And one of the real problems is that there's this notion of rushing towards legalization. 47% in Canada agree that the federal government is rushing towards legalization, and that number rose 6 points over 2017. So from the beginning of 17 to the end of 17, 6 points. The reason why is because no one has any information as to why the date was set. Why? There's no narrative. There's no narrative from industry. There's no narrative from government as to why. When there are so many things up in the air, why? And that's an important issue. So net, when you look out at scores for 2017, we did a scorecard, a whole bunch of different issues. We looked at cannabis, and we find that there's a net fail that Canadians accord to the federal government on their handling of the cannabis issue. Tight, but still 44% failed them. The reason why we feel is because many are confused. They don't have the information. They're struggling to understand this. One of the key issues that's going to become reality is the buying and selling of cannabis. It's an industry. People need to buy it. People need to see it out in space. When we asked in 2016 who should even be allowed to sell, we found that there is a real difference, a real disparity in who should be allowed. Pharmacies, dedicated stores, provincial styles. Less than a third said online should even be allowed, 2016. When we asked again in 2017 in the spring, who should own and operate this? We find that, again, there's a real difference or disparity in view relative to whether it should be government that owns and operates or a mixture of government and private. And when we unpacked that and looked at government-only options versus a mix, we find, again, a group of consumers who are completely open to sort of any suggestion, but at the same time quite confused as to what the reality could even be. It's all over the place. But what's not all over the place is what happens when you want to go and buy it yourself, okay? So how do you want to get it once it's legal? And 56% of Canadians said retail. I want to go to a store and buy it. Maybe I'll get it from friends and family, and only 5% said online. Yet we're seeing these frameworks that are unrolling at provincial levels that are relying on the online model with less emphasis on retail that is frankly tone deaf to what the market wants. And that's creating these wrong track issues that we're seeing and lack of support of the federal and provincial government's handling of these issues. People are confused about medical versus recreational. Unless you're in this room and highly into it, it's confusing. We asked a question around, okay, this is at the end, a few weeks ago, do you think do you think you should be allowed to sell medical and recreational in the same place or not? What we found is that mostly people are split on that. 46% would say, yeah, no, it has to be sold separately. Meanwhile, almost an equal number would say same location. But when you look at whether people support legalization or not, those numbers open way up. And those who oppose are far more likely to want to see it separate than those who support. Okay? It's kind of intuitive for anyone who's outside of the bubble. But from our point of view, if you're an industry watcher or a part of, and you're looking and you understand the medical cannabis space, you don't want to be treated like recreational. You want your medicine to be treated like medicine. And that's actually lost on the majority of your advocates, people who do support it today, because they don't have the information. It's lost on them. But what's not lost on them is this notion of taxation of medical. Should you tax medical? No. And that's very clear whether you support it or not. So rounding out, we wanted to understand, am I going up or down? Down, okay. We wanted to understand, with many unanswered questions, should the following be allowed going forward? Yes or no? Okay? And let's look at the no's first. So Canadians said no, 67% no. You shouldn't be allowed to advertise cannabis brands. 66% said no. They don't want to buy cannabis-infused foods in restaurants. They don't want public spaces where you can consume cannabis, 53%. And really interesting here is 56% who said, no, we don't require a comparable number of stores as there are liquor stores. Now, dial that back a little bit and look at retail is the bricks and mortars where people want to go. They want to go, they want to walk into a store and purchase cannabis in those spaces. However, they recognize that there doesn't need to be one on every corner. And that's kind of important when you're rolling towards legalization. What do people want to see? Well, this time next year, 48% of Canadians want to see high-end cannabis stores with expert staff. They want people to be able to grow it at home. And they even, in some instances, want existing dispensaries to be able to sell recreational cannabis. Fairly dichotomous view on that one. Almost the same number of people say no to that, but it's much higher here in British Columbia, not surprisingly. But the takeaway here, the 100% non-negotiable, what do people want to see? 76% of people want to see credible health and awareness information. There is a thirst and a desire, a burning desire for information about how all of this is going to work. And it comes through over and over again on those sort of social norms, information about how to react in the new normal. So a few things to sort of take away. First of all, this was a calculated political risk for the Liberals in the campaign. They campaigned on it. You may recall they didn't campaign on it as front and center, number one, but it was part of their platform, and they were very clear and they didn't back down from it. Really, it's one of the first things that they've decided to really put a lot of steam behind, and there's a reason why. We know that over time the issue is going to polarize. So now we're looking at largely sort of a split on support versus oppose. But among their supporters at the federal level, 6 in 10 Liberals and NDP support legalization, which is a polar opposite of legalization support among Conservative voters. So it's an effective wedge. It's working. 46% of Liberal voters at the federal level say that the feds are doing a good job of handling it. That's 18 points higher than the average in Canada. So they're supported by their base. And over 6 in 10 Liberal voters in the plurality of NDP give them a passing grade at the end of the year on where things are going into this critical year, which is, again, polar opposite to Conservative voters. So it's working, it's effective. It's risky because even a third of Liberal supporters say that they agree that they're rushing. So in the absence of this narrative as to why, from industry and government, why there's risk going into legalization in 2018. And fundamentally, there's a real desire or need to tackle this new normal. There's no doubt that Canadians today are concerned and confused about legalization. There needs to be, you need to clearly communicate, both from a government point of view and industry point of view, what the retail plans are. A press release with no follow-up is confusing. People aren't following it, and all they hear is each other talking about it. There's no clean narrative as to what these plans are. The plans that have been outlined to date are largely out of step with consumer preferences, and that has to be addressed. That gap has to be addressed. Otherwise, this whole thing could fall on itself and become a disaster this time next year. You need to address safety and protocols around this e-commerce funnel. How are we going to protect our kids from going online and buying it? Okay? How do I know that? How do I know what are the mechanisms and procedures in place for buying this stuff online? It's essential. And you need to clearly, coherently, convincingly address concerns over youth access. This is the primary driver of concern and opposition. Increased use is another one. Well, everyone's going to smoke cannabis now, okay? Probably not, but no one's talking about it, and we're not really addressing that from an industry or government point of view. And ultimately, there's a need to tackle this new normal. We're looking at a reality where social norms themselves need to be addressed and changed. And from an industry point of view and a government point of view, that needs to be addressed. There needs to be a plan. There needs to be an engagement strategy against that. And right now, people are left in a vacuum, frankly, when it comes to that information. And that's the research that I have for you this morning. So hopefully it was useful, and hopefully it assists a little bit in the panel discussions ahead and the rest of your weekend. So thank you very much.
So we've got a little bit of time, and Elliot, if you don't mind, I'm going to start off with a question right off the bat. I'm always surprised about the legalization rates on those who support it. And
Okay.
so, at the beginning, when we started doing the polling, it was at 60-some%.
60% and 16.
And now it's dropped down to about 43, 42, which has been
Yeah.
consistent over the last 2 years. Any
Yeah.
thoughts as to why that's the case now?
Yeah, well, so in 2016, on the timeline, recall that this was prior to the federal government striking the task force to legalize cannabis,
Yeah.
which started the work started over the summer, 16, not long after the election. So the way in which we are framing the question was plans, right? So the federal government, the new government, plans on legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes. Do you support or oppose it? And that number was 60%. When we retested it, it wasn't the plans anymore, it was do you support or oppose this new reality. So as the plans became real, it's not surprising that people started to sort of polarize and support dropped. And in fact, what grew was the middle ground initially, which is now compressed again in favor of opposition.
Okay, and Elliot, if you wouldn't mind, what are your future plans for this polling for?
So social norms us is hugely. Oh, I think I've cut out. Social norms for us is really one of the key questions that we need to address. A lot of the mechanics of how this is going to come into play and how industry and government are going to soften that and communicate it, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But from our point of view, where there's, I keep cutting out. Okay, from our, am I in the wrong spot? Use the mic.
Yeah, try the mic.
Is this better? Whoa.
Maybe why don't you stand more over there?
All right, I'll try
Maybe
over
it's closer to the mic. We'll get this figured out. Oh, how's that, Elliot? No, okay, well, might as well come back to
Is this better? Okay. So the social norms piece for us is essential in helping our clients to navigate this new space, but also in understanding how new workplaces, family discussions, all of those things are going to start coming into play this time next year. So one of the things that is really important for us is to help, if you kind of think about sitting down at a workplace party, and today you would have a glass of red wine with your boss. This time next year you can vape in front of your boss. So are you going to do that or not? It's those sorts of really, really emotional and tricky questions that are going to that is really what's on everyone's mind. There's no longer a question of whether it's going to happen or not. It's now really how are we going to manage this process? And that's where we're going to focus the research.
Well, Elliot, thank you very much for that. I just want to let people know we don't necessarily have mics out there, but Elliot will be immediately available if you have specific questions for him. And then, of course, the research is available. So we're happy to obviously share that with the audience. And if you have specific questions, come see Elliot. So Elliot, thank you very much for that. And I also just wanted to thank quickly, the Lift organizers. I think these conferences are extremely important. Specifically, I wanted to thank David Brown, who has been doing a phenomenal job with putting these things on, and Desi Pavlova.